Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. I just wanted to remind everyone that Across State Lines is now available on a wide variety of podcast streaming platforms. We are on YouTube, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, Spotify, Pocket Casts, Deezer, Listen Notes, and Player FM, and we will soon be on Apple Music. Thank you so much for tuning into episode 3, where we will be discussing a historic case, the 1892 murders of Andrew and Abby Borden, and the investigation and trial of Lizzie Borden. There is a lot of divide on this case, with most people being staunchly in the camp that Lizzie Borden is solely guilty, but other people believe that she may have had help in executing the plan to kill her parents, or was assisted in a cover-up. Movies and plays throughout the years have made this case widely well known, and one movie has even led to the popular theory that Lizzie committed the murders in the nude, as that's exactly how it was portrayed in the made-for-TV movie, The Legend of Lizzie Borden, with Elizabeth Montgomery in 1975. You may remember the song from childhood, Skipping Rope while your classmates sang the morbid song about Lizzie Borden and her parents' grisly murder. That was most people's first introduction to the case of Fall River's infamous murder in 1892. However, the song isn't quite accurate, and it is still unknown if Lizzie Borden was responsible for the murders of her father and stepmother, or if it was someone else known to the family. Lizzie Andrew Borden was born in Fall River, Massachusetts on July 19, 1860, to parents Sarah Anthony Morse Borden and Andrew Jackson Borden. Sarah and Andrew had 3 children total: Emma, who was 9 years older than Lizzie; Alice, who would not live to see her second birthday, having died of dropsy of the brain, which is now known as hydrocephaly; and then Lizzie, who came along a couple years later. When Lizzie was 2 years old, tragedy would strike the family again when Sarah would pass away from uterine congestion and spinal disease at the age of 39. Emma took Lizzie under her wing after her mother's death, caring for her and acting as woman of the house in the absence of Sarah. Andrew, who felt he needed a mother to care for his young girls, remarried 3 years later to a woman named Abby Gray, who stepped in and took on the role of stepmother to the 2 girls. The sisters did not ever warm up to Abby, though, especially Emma, who had felt she was handling things just fine without a stepmother, and would often call Abby Mrs. Borden rather than mother, which was more expected of her at the time. This tension would only grow throughout the years that the family lived together. Andrew Borden came from a lineage of wealth in Fall River, but had struggled financially in his young adult years before he made a name for himself in the manufacturing business. Andrew began to be successful in selling furniture and caskets before he set his sights on property development, where he really prospered in his final years. Andrew owned several textile mills, commercial properties, and was the president of the Union Savings Bank and director of the Safe Deposit and Trust Company. At the time of Andrew's death, he was worth about $300,000, which is equivalent to $10 million in today's money. Despite accumulating so much wealth, Andrew was notoriously frugal. His home did not have any plumbing installed, despite being common for those of affluence at the time, and where most of the wealthy Fall River residents lived in the Hill neighborhood, the Borden family lived in a 2-story home in a more industrial area. This became a huge point of contention between the 4 members of the Borden house. Despite being unmarried at the age of 32, something that was considered very unusual in the late 1800s, Lizzie kept herself busy with her many passions. Lizzie spent much of her weekends teaching Sunday school, served as secretary-treasurer for the Christian Endeavor Society, and spent a lot of her time in women's focused organizations, such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Mission. Lizzie was a well-loved and active member of the community in Fall River. Inside the Borden home, however, tensions were mounting steadily in 1892. Emma and Lizzie would rarely acknowledge their stepmother Abby, who they believed had only married their father for his money. This feeling was amplified when Andrew had paid to purchase a home for Abby's sister, which was something that had greatly offended both Lizzie and Emma. The two women approached their father and demanded that they purchase one of Andrew's rental properties for $1, which he reluctantly agreed to. It wasn't long before the two sisters sold that same home back to their father for $5,000 and moved back into the Borden home. Around this time, Lizzie was speaking to a local dressmaker of the troubles happening in the home and had called Abby a mean old thing. In May of 1892, Lizzie had been caring for a flock of pigeons in the family barn, which she loved and adored, and had recently built a roost for. One evening, Lizzie had returned home and checked in on her pigeons when she discovered that they'd been hacked to death and were lying lifeless at the bottom of her homemade roost. Andrew's defense for killing the pigeons was that he believed that the birds were attracting young children who were trying to hunt them. In July of 1892, both Emma and Lizzie would take extended trips out of town. In August, shortly before the deaths of Abby and Andrew, Lizzie spent 4 nights in a boarding house instead of the family home. When Lizzie had returned home, the entire family, along with the maid Bridget, who they had called Maggie, fell ill with what they believed was food poisoning. Lizzie later explained that due to her father's frugal ways, a mutton stew had been on the stove for several days at the time of the murders, and that the family had been eating from it to save money. Abby would visit the local doctor, Dr. Bowen, on August 2nd, complaining of severe stomach pains, and speculated that she might have been poisoned. Dr. Bowen was skeptical of this claim and reassured Abby that she most likely was dealing with a bout of food poisoning. However, on August 3rd, Lizzie went to the local pharmacist asking him for prussic acid, claiming she wants to use it to clean her sealskin cape. Prussic acid is now commonly called hydrogen cyanate, a deadly poison. Suspicious of her claims, the pharmacist denied her the purchase. On the evening of August 3rd, 1892, the Borden home received an unexpected visitor. At their doorstep was John Morse, the brother of Andrew's first wife, Sarah. While John did not arrive with any luggage or toiletries, he had agreed to spend the evening in the family's guest room and spend the next day around Fall River visiting another family member. That evening, John stated that he had not seen Lizzie at all, and this was because Lizzie was visiting her friend Alice Russell's home. While Lizzie was at Alice's home, she spoke about how she feared her family was being poisoned because, quote, her father had enemies, and that she had seen suspicious people lurking around the Borden home. She told Alice, quote, I am afraid that someone will do something. The next morning at 7 a.m., Andrew, Abby, John, and Bridget gathered around the dining room table to have breakfast. The 4 ate more old mutton stew, mutton broth, Johnny cakes, bananas, and sugar cookies. Lizzie briefly popped in, but due to her current refusal to dine with her stepmother, she just grabbed some molasses cookies and took them with her, and Emma was out of town visiting friends. Afterwards, John and Andrew went to the sitting room, and Abby began to do her morning chores, instructing Bridget to clean the windows of the entire house, a job that must have been taxing for Bridget as she was still dealing with vomiting from her bout of food poisoning. While outside cleaning the windows, Bridget spoke over the fence to the neighbor's maid, whom she was friendly with, and was also seen vomiting into the grass. 20 minutes before 9, John Morse left the home out the rear door of the kitchen. He told in later testimony that once he left the home, Andrew hooked the lock behind him. He also stated in later testimony what his day looked like. He went to the post office, walked 1.25 miles to Waybosset Street to visit with his niece and nephew, where he spent the morning. His nephew wasn't home, however, but he did visit with his niece until about 11:20 in the morning. Back at the Borden home at 9 a.m., Andrew left for his morning walk and errands. Sometime between 9 and 9:30, Abby went upstairs to tidy up the guest room where John had been staying and to make up the bed for her guest's second night. While in the guest room, someone had walked in and approached her. According to the autopsy, Abby was facing this person when she was struck with a hatchet on the side of her head, cutting her just above the ear. The force of this blow caused Abby to turn and fall face down on the floor, which caused contusions to her face and her nose. When she was down, the assailant struck Abby in the back of the head a total of 17 times, killing her. She laid on the guest room floor undetected for several hours, despite the door being open and her body being visible from the staircase directly in front of the door. Around 10:30 a.m., Andrew approached his front door only to find it locked, so he knocked on the door to be let in. Bridget answered the door, and when she did, it jammed. She later claims that she heard someone giggle from the top of the stairs. Whoever it was directly in view of Abby's lifeless body on the guest room floor. Bridget later testified that the laugh sounded like Lizzie, but she couldn't be sure. Andrew makes his way to the sitting room carrying a small parcel, and Lizzie enters letting him know that Abby wasn't home. She had received a note from a sick friend, and Abby went to this friend at once to help her out. This was deemed as strange, as Abby didn't have many friends in Fall River, if any at all. Bridget claims that she came into the sitting room and helped Andrew into his slippers, taking off his boots. And this was later challenged in court, because Andrew was indeed found in his boots and not slippers. Andrew tells the two women that he is going to lie down on the sofa and take a midday nap, and Bridget, who was still feeling unwell, retired to her room in the attic. According to Lizzie, she claims that she went out into the barn to look for sinkers for an upcoming fishing trip and took with her 3 pears from the pear tree outside the family home. At around 11 a.m., Andrew was attacked with a hatchet like his wife. While he lay sleeping on the sofa, an assailant snuck into the room and gave Andrew 11 blows to the head and face. One of these blows cleanly cut through Andrew's left eye, splitting it in 2. Shortly after the murder, Lizzie walks into the sitting room and began to scream for Bridget, claiming that someone had snuck into the home and killed her father. One of the women ran to Dr. Bowen's home, summoning him to come help. Once Dr. Bowen arrived and Andrew's body was discovered, those on scene began to ask where Abby was. Lizzie had stated that Abby received a note from a sick friend asking for her assistance at the friend's home, and Lizzie assumed that she had been out. Lizzie was asked to search the home for her stepmother, but she did not want to. She asked Bridget and a neighbor, Mrs. Churchill, to search instead. Bridget, who was extremely rattled, and Mrs. Churchill, who was confused about what was occurring, were both hesitant, but agreed to look for Mrs. Borden anyhow. The pair walked up the steps to the second floor of the home, where they immediately saw Abby lying on the floor beside the bed in the guest room. Bridget ran downstairs to alert the police present in the home, and Mrs. Churchill approached the lifeless body of Abby, bearing witness to the brutal nature of the crime. Officer George Allen was the first on scene, as other officers were in Rocky Point, Rhode Island, attending a police function. Once the bodies were discovered, he immediately called all hands on deck, and the other officers returned back to Fall River. When the bodies were examined in the places that they had been killed, they noted that while Andrew's blood was bright red, fresh, and still flowing from his wounds, Abby's blood was dark brown and congealed. They determined that there was a significant time difference between the two murders, about 90 minutes. While Dr. Bowen ran to send a telegram to Emma Borden, who was visiting friends in Fairhaven, Alice approached Lizzie in the sitting room. Alice attempted to undo the collar of Lizzie's dress. Back in those times, clothing was very constrictive, and she feared that Lizzie might faint due to the stress of the situation in the heat of the August afternoon. When Alice was reaching for the buttons of Lizzie's collar, Lizzie grabbed her by the hand and said to Alice, quote, "I'm not going to faint." Alice had asked Lizzie where she was during the time of the murders, and Lizzie told her that she had been sitting in the hot, dusty barn searching for sinkers for her upcoming fishing trip with friends, and that she had spent about 30 minutes seated in the barn, eating pears that she had picked from the fair's blossoming tree. Soon after this, Lizzie ascended the stairs to the second floor of the home and entered Emma's room. Alice soon followed Lizzie, wanting to be of comfort to her, and when she entered Emma's room, she witnessed Lizzie tying the strings of a pink wrap dress that she had just put on. At the time of the murders, Lizzie had been seen wearing a blue gingham-patterned dress. Officers were puzzled by the lack of blood surrounding the bodies. While there was blood pooled around their heads, there wasn't a significant amount of blood spatter along the walls and the furniture. Despite the lack of blood spatter, an officer who had arrived on scene went on to say that he had been a soldier in the Civil War, and what he had seen in the Borden house that day had been more grisly and more depraved than anything he had ever witnessed in war. In fact, despite the gruesome scene, he stated that he was very surprised at how undisturbed and calm Lizzie had been. Many officers that day noted how calm and collected Lizzie appeared to be, with some stating that she had been almost cold and distant. When an officer had been speaking to Lizzie about Abby, he called Mrs. Borden her mother, and Lizzie sharply corrected him, saying, "She is not my mother. My mother is dead." Authorities began to interview Lizzie, where she repeated the same story about Abby going to the Friends and how she had been in the barn searching for sinkers and eating pears. Lizzie then offered them some interesting information. She stated that there was a bowl of bloody rags in the cellar downstairs, but not to worry about them because she was soaking those rags to remove the blood due to her menstrual cycle. It is assumed by many that the police felt bringing up this information was scandalized, because at that time, men did not talk to women about such things, and they were quick to let that fact go and ignore the bowl. Officers wanted a more concrete timeline of Lizzie's movements that day, and she explained to them what her day had looked like. She claims that when her father got home, she entered the kitchen to heat up some irons to iron some handkerchiefs, and while she waited for the irons to get hot, she flipped through an old Harper magazine. She then remembered her upcoming fishing trip, so she left through the kitchen door, leaving it unlocked, went to the pear tree and picked 3 pears, and then entered the barn. She sat in the barn that was well over 100 degrees inside, as it was 90 degrees outside, and slowly ate her pears, looking at the home, and then she rifled through the barn for some sinkers. She claimed that at one point she had heard what sounded like a groan and then a scraping sound. After hearing that, she went back into the home where she discovered her father dead and sounded the alarm. Despite Lizzie, who was outside the home and in the barn hearing those sounds, Bridget, who was in the home, stated that she heard nothing of the sort. During this questioning, police asked Lizzie if there was anyone who might have wanted to hurt her father or mother, and Lizzie stated no, there was no one that she could think of. Alice, who was standing nearby, overheard this statement and interjected, saying, quote, "Lizzie, don't you remember what you told me last night?" Lizzie then backtracks, stating that there had been a previous break-in of the home and that her family had been very sick that week, and she believes that they might have been poisoned. Many speculate that the prior break into the home where items were stolen might have been stolen by Lizzie herself, as she had a known history of stealing from local shops. Lizzie frequently shoplifted around town, and Andrew would soon after quietly pay her debts to the store owners. Lizzie also offers 2 new stories to the mix. She claims that 1 or 2 weeks prior to the murders, there had been a man she did not know in her home, speaking to her father in a different room. She had overheard this man telling Andrew that he wanted to set up his business in one of Andrew's buildings, but Andrew refused to allow it, and a verbal altercation had occurred. Following the altercation, Andrew had demanded that this man leave his home. Officers asked Lizzie who this man was, and she claimed that she did not know, but that she assumed he was from out of town because she had overheard him say that he needed to return home and speak to his business partner. In another instance, Lizzie recalled that she had seen a dark, shadowy figure lurking outside the home one night when she returned back to the Borden house, but she could not give any further details. Police then relieved Lizzie and allowed her to go to her room after questioning. Later in the day, police wanted to search Lizzie's room, take a look at her clothing. They ascended the stairs and knocked on Lizzie's door, but were greeted by Dr. Bowen. Dr. Bowen had been in the room treating Lizzie with morphine to settle her nerves, and police asked permission to search the room, as it was custom to never enter a woman's room without permission in the time period. Dr. Bowen closed the door, spoke to Lizzie, and returned asking if it was absolutely necessary. Officers claimed that it was, and the room was searched, but nothing of value was discovered. The rest of the home was also searched, and they removed 2 axes and a hatchet from the cellar. Officers also scoured the barn, where they noticed that there had been no footprints in the dirt floor of the barn, and they believed that no one had been inside for some time. On the evening that the murders took place, Alice Russell had stayed the night, along with Lizzie and John Morse. Alice had slept in Andrew and Abby's bed, and later went on to state that it gave her a very eerie feeling sleeping in that bed, knowing that Andrew and Abby would never sleep in that bed again. While the 3 occupied the home, the 2 slain bodies were still laid out on the dining room table downstairs post-autopsy. That evening, Officer Joseph Hyde was posted outside to watch over the crime scene when Alice exited the home at 8:30 to tell him that they were going to bed. Alice went back inside, where she encountered Lizzie, and Lizzie told her that she was going to empty the bedpans in the cellar downstairs. Alice offered to do it for her, but Lizzie refused. Alice then offered to hold the lamp for her at the very least, and the 2 entered the cellar, where Joseph Hyde could see them through the window due to the glow of the lamp. He watched Lizzie dump something into the sink, and the 2 women went back upstairs. 15 minutes later, Hyde sees Lizzie enter the cellar again, this time alone. He observed her place the lamp on the table and walk over to the sink, where she stood for about 2 minutes. Due to Lizzie's back facing him, he could not see what Lizzie was doing. The next day, Hyde asks Alice about the incident in the cellar, and Alice tells him that she went with Lizzie down there. He clarifies that he saw them both go down there, but that Lizzie returned on her own about 15 minutes later. Alice tells Joseph Hyde that Lizzie must have gone down there while Alice was in the bath. She also stated that she wants to show him something. She brings Hyde to the room that she was staying in and points to a 20-inch club on the foot of her bed, stating that it had not been there before and that she was scared. Alice wound up staying one more night in the Borden home, but slept in a different room. She believed that the club must have been put there to scare her and to deter her from staying another night. The funeral for Andrew and Abby was held on August 6, 1892, in the family home. After the funeral, police asked Lizzie for the clothing she had been wearing on the day of the murder, and she hands over 3 items: a dark blue blouse, a patterned skirt, and a white underskirt. Lizzie approached the mayor, who attended the funeral, and asked him if they have any suspects. The mayor began to dance around the subject, not wanting to give any yes or no answers, but when Lizzie pressed the subject, he told her that yes, they did have a suspect, and that suspect was her. Lizzie stated, quote, "Arrest me then." The following Monday, Alice was back at the Borden home, but she had to leave to run a few personal errands. Alice arrived back at the home around noon and entered the kitchen to find a surprising scene. Emma was standing near the sinks, and Lizzie was standing in front of the wood-burning fireplace with strips of blue fabric in her hands, feeding it to the fire. When Alice asked Lizzie what on earth she was doing, Lizzie replied that it was an old dress that had paint on it, and she wanted to destroy it. Knowing how bad this looked, Alice was disturbed, and she briefly stepped out of the kitchen to reflect on it. When she entered the kitchen once again, Lizzie was still burning the dress, and she could see more blue fabric shoved inside of a cupboard behind some pots and pans. Alice tells Lizzie that she shouldn't let anyone see her doing that, and Lizzie didn't respond, instead meeting her statement with silence. That same day, police searched the Borden home again. They started in the barn, then the attic, making their way down through each level of the house until they ended up in the cellar. When previously searched, officers collected 2 axes and a hatchet, which they didn't believe were used in the murder. But during their new search, they discovered the blade of another hatchet with its wooden handle broken off. It had not been there during their first search. This blade had a white ashy substance on it, which made it appear to be old, but the other tools in the toolbox where the blade was found did not have the substance on it. Police believe that it may have been the murder weapon and had been put in a fire to destroy any evidence. That same day, police spoke to Alice once again, and they specifically asked her if she believed that all the dresses and the clothing in the home were still present. Alice hesitantly said yes, despite knowing of the burned dress. But after this line of questioning, it nagged at Alice that she had lied and covered for Lizzie. Alice approached Lizzie and Emma, telling them that she was upset about having had to lie to the police. Alice told Lizzie that burning that dress was the worst thing she could have done. Lizzie responded to this statement saying, quote, "Why did you let me do it then?" At this point, Emma steps in and tells Alice that her and Lizzie both agree that she should be forthright with the police and tell them what she had witnessed, and that they were not worried about it. After Alice comes clean with the police, they search the home for all the clothing and determine none of the clothing had any paint on it. However, they already knew that one item of clothing, a blue dress, had a pinpoint blood stain on it. Lizzie claims that this blood stain was from her menstrual cycle. An inquest was held on August 9th through the 11th to see if there was enough evidence to arrest Lizzie Borden for the murder of her father and stepmother. Several people were questioned during this inquest, including Lizzie herself, John Morse, and Bridget. Bridget had a very clear and concise timeline of the day of the murders, and her story never changed. When John Morse was questioned, he had an airtight alibi. He left the Borden home after breakfast, went to his niece's home, and on the way back, he took a trolley to the Borden house, of which he remembered the exact trolley number, along with the name of 3 priests he met and spoke with on the ride home. Some would later come to think that this alibi was a little too detailed. After Bridget and John's testimonies, Lizzie was brought to the stand. The authorities specifically wanted to see if Lizzie's account would match Bridget's, and they wanted to see if her story had at all changed. However, her story did not match up with Bridget's version of that day, and Lizzie's story began to differ from her own original account. This time, Lizzie claimed that she had woken up after everybody had already eaten breakfast, and that she couldn't remember if she herself had eaten breakfast or not. She stated that she had seen Miss Borden downstairs dusting, wearing her informal clothing that she typically cleans in. She went on to say that Andrew Borden descended the stairs to leave the home for the morning, and the 3 women went about their daily chores. Lizzie claims that she then took out her irons in the kitchen and set them on the stove to heat, which differed from Bridget's account, who stated that Lizzie did not do this until after Andrew already came home. Under Lizzie's account of that morning, this puts her in the kitchen around the time leading up to Abby's murder. When asked how long this might have taken her to do, Lizzie says that she does not know. They determined that since this was during the time of Abby's murder, Lizzie does not have an alibi. When Lizzie was asked where she was during the time of her father's murder, she testified that she was in the kitchen reading the Harper magazine before she went out to the barn. This, however, contradicts Bridget's testimony about hearing Lizzie laugh at the top of the stairs when she let Andrew Borden into the house. Moreover, if Lizzie was at the top of the stairs when her father was let in, this would put her directly in the line of sight of Abby's body in the guest room. This prompted further questioning, and Lizzie was asked if she was sure that she was in the kitchen during the time period her father went into the sitting room and was murdered. Lizzie claimed that she was not sure, that at one point she had to go upstairs to sew tape onto a garment, but that it only took 5 minutes. She was asked once again if she went upstairs when her father returned home, and she said that she did not know, but she thinks so, contradicting her first statements. She then definitively claims that she was in fact downstairs in the kitchen at the time. Lizzie then testifies that the last time she saw Abby was downstairs dusting when she told Lizzie that she had received the note from the friend and would be leaving to go attend to them. However, no one ever came forward to claim that they had ever written this note, and it was a known fact that Abby did not have many friends, if any at all, in Fall River. Lizzie was asked if she had seen her stepmother leave, and Lizzie stated that she did not. She was told that if she had been in the kitchen that morning like Lizzie had claimed, that Lizzie would have seen Abby ascend the stairs to change into her proper clothing to leave the house. It would also be impossible for Lizzie to not have seen Abby come back down the stairs when Abby went to leave the home. Lizzie vehemently denied having seen Abby go up or down the stairs. Police determined that it was virtually impossible for an intruder to have committed the murders because the house was locked up tight, so much so that Andrew could not even access his own home that morning. They also found it suspicious the amount of time that had lapsed between the two murders, noting that the killer would have waited around 90 minutes between the killings. They also pointed to the fact that nothing had been stolen from the home. And finally, they also noted that it was strange that only Andrew and Abby had been murdered when both Bridget and Lizzie were present on the property that day. The inquest concluded that the motive for the murder was that Lizzie was angry at her father for being so stingy, and the hatred she harbored for her stepmother, believing that she would financially gain from their deaths. If Abby had not been killed, her father's inheritance would go to Abby, so they believed that Abby had to die first. Lizzie Borden was arrested directly after the inquest. It was stated that Emma sobbed at the verdict, but Lizzie didn't flinch. When asked if she wanted the arrest warrant read to her, Lizzie refused. Once behind bars, her tough and stoic exterior began to fade, and she crumbled into herself, crying and wailing. The matron of the jail was so worried about Lizzie that she had called Dr. Bowen to come visit at once. Once there, the doctor treated Lizzie with morphine, and Lizzie began to settle into her new life as a prisoner who was to go on trial for her parents' murder. With nothing but time on her hands, Lizzie began to secure her defense, and with her new influx of money, she was able to hire what was considered the dream team of lawyers in Massachusetts at the time. These defense lawyers were well known, well respected, and had a reputation for getting their clients off with a non-guilty verdict much of the time. Her defense consisted of 3 men: Andrew Jackson Jennings, Melvin Ohio Adams, and George Dexter Robinson. George Dexter Robinson was particularly notable as he was Harvard educated and was previously part of the Massachusetts State Senate and then governor of the state. The trial began on June 5, 1893, in the New Bedford courthouse, nearly 1 year after the deaths of Andrew and Abby Borden. The jury was comprised of 12 men. While it wasn't illegal for women to be part of a jury during this time, it was highly unusual, and most juries were made up of only men. Much in the same way the defense was made up of 3 lawyers, the counsel was made up of 3 presiding judges: Justice Justin Dewey, Chief Justice Albert Mason, and Judge Caleb Blodgett. In what may be seen as a conflict of interest, Justice Justin Dewey was appointed as a judge by none other than the former governor and defense attorney of Lizzie Borden, George Dexter Robinson. District Attorney Knowlton and Thomas Moody would be speaking on behalf of the prosecution. The 3 judges made some initial rulings in the case, which threw out some important evidence that the prosecution held. Firstly, the entire testimony that Lizzie gave during her inquest was not eligible to be used in the trial, as Dr. Bowen claimed that not only was Lizzie under the effects of morphine at the time, he had actually given her a higher dose than usual on the day of her inquest testimony. In addition to this, they would also not allow the testimony of the pharmacist whom Lizzie attempted to buy the prussic acid from. They stated that since Andrew and Abby had not been killed by poison, but rather an attack with a hatchet, this testimony was deemed as inadmissible during the trial. Prior to the trial, Andrew and Abby's bodies were exhumed. In a shocking moment in the courthouse, Thomas Moody placed one of Lizzie's blue frocks on the table, and when he lifted it into the air, it revealed the skulls of Abby and Andrew stripped of flesh. When Lizzie saw her parents' bashed-in skulls, she swooned and fainted, shocked by what she was seeing. A local newspaper reported on this moment saying, quote, "Into a faint that lasted several minutes, sending a thrill of excitement through awestruck spectators and causing unfeigned embarrassment and discomfort to penetrate the ranks of counsel." End quote. The trial had to be momentarily put on hold while Lizzie came to. Moody spoke for nearly 2 hours about how only Lizzie had the motive to kill her parents, stating her hatred for Abby and her resentment towards Andrew for his frugal ways, before he pulled from a bag the broken-off hatchet blade, claiming that this was the murder weapon. Many people were cross-examined, including Dr. Bowen, friends, and family, as well as Bridget. Bridget claimed that Lizzie was the only person in the home with her on that day that the Bordens were killed, and that the family had been experiencing severe stomach pains in the days leading up to the murders. She described the moments that Andrew knocked on the door, how she heard Lizzie laugh at the top of the stairs, and that at the time the pair were killed, she did not see Lizzie from where Bridget was at, both outside and in her room in the attic. The matron from the jail also testified, where she shared an interesting story of something she had overheard between the two sisters, Lizzie and Emma, while Lizzie was in her prison cell. She claims that Emma came to visit Lizzie and the two had a heated discussion, where she overheard Lizzie say to Emma, quote, "Emma, you have given me away, haven't you?" Emma responded with, "No, Lizzie." Lizzie followed up with, "You have, and you'll see, I won't give an inch." Dr. Edward Woods, a bloodstain and poison expert from Harvard, was also brought to the stand to testify. Upon his findings, Dr. Woods determined that Abby had 11 ounces of partially digested food and liquid still inside her stomach, which indicated that Abby had died about 2 to 3 hours after eating her last meal. When Andrew's organs were dissected, it revealed that he had been further along in his digestion process and that most of the food was already out of his stomach and in his intestines, proving that the time of his death was about 3 to 4 hours after his last meal. Their stomachs were also tested for poison, and none was found. In addition, the milk at the family home was tested for any evidence of poison, and this too was found to not have any traces. The jury was presented with the potential murder weapons: a claw hammer, 2 axes, a hatchet, and a hatchet blade with the handle broken off. All items had been tested for blood, and they determined that no blood had been found. A hair had been discovered on one of the tools, but it was analyzed and determined to have been an animal hair, most likely from a cow. The prosecution particularly pointed towards the hatchet blade with the handle broken off as the murder weapon. When the defense had asked the prosecution where the handle of the hatchet was, the state had no answer. Both sides agreed that the blood could have been washed off of the tools, but that it would have taken a considerable amount of time due to the grooves and crevices between the blades and the handles. Prosecution claimed that the handle was most likely broken off in order to hide any blood embedded inside it. The defense also drove home the tight timeline that the state presented. They reiterated the fact that Lizzie would have had only 8 to 13 minutes to clean up, change, and sound the alarm from when Andrew died to when Lizzie called for Bridget. The issue of bloodstains was brought up in the courthouse, with the prosecution pointing to a small, pinpoint-sized bloodstain on one of Lizzie's underskirts. This bloodstain was located 6 inches from the bottom hem of the skirt, was very minuscule in size, and was determined to be human blood. The defense fought back, cross-examining Dr. Woods, and asked him if the blood could have been from Lizzie's menstrual cycle. He said that yes, it could be. The defense had their own key witnesses to testify on the behalf of Lizzie. 2 men named Charles Gifford and Uriah Kirby claimed that they had seen a strange man around the Borden house at about 11 o'clock the night before the murders. Another man, Dr. Benjamin Hanfee, stated that he had seen a pale-faced man on the sidewalk outside the Borden home around 10:30 a.m. on August 4th. Additionally, the defense brought in a plumber who testified that he had been inside the Borden's barn 2 weeks prior, which cast doubt on the prosecution's claim that Lizzie couldn't have possibly been in the barn that day because they hadn't found any footprints in the dirt inside of it. At the end of the trial, both sides had the opportunity to give their closing arguments. The defense argued that Lizzie had no motive to commit the murders and that she was not strong enough to have enough force to create the blows and the damage to the skulls. They made mention that there was no true physical evidence that linked Lizzie to the crime and that the murder weapon had never been found. The prosecution were up next, and they spoke to Bridget's testimony, how anytime Bridget left Lizzie alone that morning, someone had died. They also mentioned how the supposed note that Abby had received had never been found, and that the only proof that it had ever existed was because Lizzie said it had. In the aftermath of the murder, advertisements were placed in the newspapers offering a $5,000 reward for anyone who had any information about the note, but not a single person came forward. The 12 jurors left the courthouse and deliberated for 90 minutes. These jurors would later say that they knew their verdict almost immediately after leaving the courtroom, but that they waited the 90 minutes so their decision wouldn't appear rash. When the jurors entered the courtroom again, the judges asked them if they had their verdict, and they unanimously said yes. When asked what the verdict was, the jury foreman stated, "Not guilty." At this moment, Lizzie let out a gasp and sank into her chair and wept. She stood up and held Emma, saying, "Now take me home. I want to go to the old place and go at once tonight." In the aftermath of the trial, Lizzie was determined to resume her old life and stay in Fall River. However, the community wasn't so kind to her and were shocked at her acquittal. Lizzie was shunned by her community, much in the way Lizzie had shunned Abby's family when she saw them walking on the streets. The societies that Lizzie was a part of made her resign from her position, and she was prohibited from teaching Sunday school. On August 10th, 1893, one of Lizzie's dreams had finally come true. Her and Emma had purchased a home on the hill at 7 French Street for $13,000, which they lovingly called Maplecroft. However, neighbors on the hill were not pleased that a potential murderer had moved into their otherwise quiet and safe neighborhood. Her home was repeatedly vandalized. Around Halloween, children would pull straws, and whoever came up with the short straw had to approach Maplecroft and ring the doorbell. And that infamous song about Lizzie Borden was created around this time period, so when Lizzie walked around town, she heard the sound of children's voices singing about her as they skipped rope. Lizzie changed her name to Lizbeth shortly after the trial, hoping to rebrand herself. Lizbeth expanded her circle of friends and began to associate with artists and actresses in the area, and she would often throw lavish parties at her home. One of her closest friends was actress Nance O'Neill, and many at the time suspected that Lizbeth and Nance were more than friends, having grown a romantic relationship between them. In 1905, Lizbeth threw a grand party for Nance at Maplecroft, and shortly after, Lizbeth and Emma would go their separate ways for good. Lizbeth would pay Emma $150 a month for her needs, but the two sisters never spoke again. It was never clear why this might have happened, and when interviewed later in life, Emma refused to divulge. All Emma said in her 1913 interview was, quote, "The happenings at the French Street house caused me to leave. I must refuse to talk about it. I did not go until the conditions became unbearable," end quote. In 1926, Lizbeth's health was declining, and she died at her home, surrounded by close friends and servants, on June 1st, 1927, 1 month before her 67th birthday. Strangely, Emma died 9 days later at her own home. At the time of her death, Lizbeth was worth $310,000, which is roughly about $5 million in today's money. In her will, Lizbeth left the town of Fall River $500 to continue tending to her father's grave. She also left $30,000 to the Fall River Animal Rescue. Every year on Memorial Day, the Animal Rescue plants geraniums on Lizzie Borden's grave. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform, so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.